Hi everyone, and welcome back to All Things Nuclear with Diana. Today we're going to talk about a chilling story that happened in 1986, a Chernobyl disaster, a nuclear accident that changed the world. We will break down what went wrong, from unsafe decisions to flawed designs, and speak with Oleksiy Breus, a control room operator that was on duty the night after the explosion happened. His first-hand account brings raw human insight on the story that is often buried in myth. But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay in the loop of the nuclear world.
My name is Oleksiy Breus. I am 66 years old. I was 27 years old when the Chernobyl accident happened, and I was working during the disaster. I studied nuclear engineering at Bauman Moscow State Technical University. Back then, it was still an institute. Today, it's a university. I studied at the Department of Academician Nikolai Dolezhal, who was the chief designer of the Chernobyl-type reactors. I was originally trained to become a project engineer, a reactor designer. But life took a different turn, and I ended up at the control panel, becoming a reactor operator.
On the night of April 25-26, a safety test was being conducted at Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. The goal was to simulate a power outage and see if the turbine, after being shut off, could keep spinning long enough to generate power for coolant pumps until backup diesel generators turned on. This was crucial because if cooling stops, reactor overheats, leading to a potential meltdown. Ironically, that was a safety test to prevent a disaster, but that triggered the worst nuclear accident in history.
Before the accident, I had worked at the plant for 4 years. After the explosion, I stayed at the unit itself for another 3 days, but I remained officially on staff at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant for maybe a couple more years. Or maybe just one, I honestly don't remember exactly. By then, my work was no longer at the plant. I had moved to Kyiv, where I worked as a personnel training instructor. They banned me from returning to the plant because of my high radiation exposure. They just said, "That's it. That's enough." On the first day alone, I received 1.2 sieverts. For medical professionals, there's a known threshold, 100 rem, or 1 sievert. That's when radiation sickness can begin. I was slightly above that, a bit over the threshold, but officially, I wasn't diagnosed with radiation sickness.
This test wasn't the idea of local operators. It was ordered from above, by the Soviet Ministry of Energy and top nuclear engineers. Officials wanted the test completed, especially before the May Day, a major Soviet holiday just days away.
Like at any major Soviet enterprise, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had its own layers of authority, 3 powerful pillars that controlled almost everything. There was the technical administration, of course, then the trade unions, which held a surprising amount of influence, and finally, the Communist Party, which was probably the most important force of all. So, was there interference? That's more of a rhetorical question. Of course there was. The party was always present, even in technical decisions, certainly in administrative ones. Financial too, perhaps. I'm not sure. But their influence was constant. As for the reactor itself, its reliability and safety were questionable. The Soviet Union had enormous ambitions, not just economic, but political as well. It wanted to be seen as a global leader, and for that, it needed serious energy capabilities. That's why they place such a heavy emphasis on developing nuclear power.
The test was delayed during the day because the power grid needed electricity. That meant the test started late during the night shift, with less experienced operators. When the test finally began, here is what went wrong. The power was dropped too low, putting the reactor in an unstable condition. To recover power, nearly all control rods were pulled out, a direct violation of safety rules. Automatic shutdown systems were disabled to avoid interrupting the test. And critically, the RBMK reactor had built-in design flaws. A positive void coefficient means more steam equals more reactivity equals runaway reaction. Then graphite-tipped control rods, which briefly increased reactivity when inserted. And no containment structure, meaning nothing stopped radiation from escaping.
The reactor's design was like this, a vast network of pipes. And the more complex and branched this system was, the more potential defects it had. Logically speaking, for example, if some of those pipes had bends in them, water might remain trapped after a shutdown, or steam might form in the upper sections. Sometimes even air pockets would form, literally air bubbles that blocked circulation. Around the world, in countries developing nuclear energy, the main reactor type was the pressurized water reactor, PWR. These were compact. All the nuclear internals were housed inside a thick, reinforced vessel. But the Soviet Union didn't have the manufacturing capability to build such strong reactor vessels at that scale. So they decided to build vessel-less reactors based on early Soviet designs originally created for producing plutonium for nuclear weapons. They used that as a prototype and adapted it into the RBMK power reactor. Those political ambitions, they led to using a design that wasn't exactly ideal. Instead of one solid vessel, it used many small vertical channels, one for each fuel assembly, with water flowing through to remove the heat. Then they had separate vertical channels nearby for the control rods made of boron carbide, which absorb neutrons. For those unfamiliar, the principle is simple. Boron absorbs neutrons. Fewer neutrons, the chain reaction slows down. Pull the boron, and the reaction speeds up again. Power increases. It's like using pokers to stir a fire. The reactor had 211 of these rods. They either go in or out. That's it. There were also local automatic regulators. Their job was to control power not across the entire core, but in specific zones. And that's where a problem arises. Because each fuel assembly had its own individual channel, the reactor grew enormous, around 10 meters across. That large size caused uneven power distribution. More power in one part, less in another. And in transition phases, it could even increase in one spot and drop in another. Now imagine you're the operator. Safety is your job, no accidents. But you also have to ensure reliable, uninterrupted electricity production. There's also something called the steam effect. In other countires, it's called the void coefficient. When voids form in the core, in this case, steam, they act like empty space. That changes nuclear processes. What's inside the core affects how the chain reaction behaves. With RBMK, if pipes rupture and water drains out, there's no cooling. But the graphite moderator remains. So the reaction continues. And no water means a positive void effect. The reaction intensifies. It's a serious flaw. After the disaster, they added compensating systems, extra absorbers to stabilize it. But the positive void coefficient was always there. You always had to suppress it. But there was another serious flaw that wasn't documented in operator instructions. For operators, it officially didn't exist. Maybe someone had heard rumors or seen it firsthand. It was about the graphite tips on the control rods, the displacers. These weren't in the original design. They were added later. The reason? To improve efficiency. This wasn't just political ambition, it was economic. Kurchatov once said, "Neutrons belong to the state. They must be used efficiently." The RBMK was a giant cylinder, around 10 meters in diameter, 7 meters tall. At the top was a boron carbide control rod, underneath an empty space. So when the rod was withdrawn to increase reactivity, that space used to be filled with water, which absorbed neutrons a bit, but also slowed them down. But boron carbide is a stronger absorber. Still, what if instead of water, we had graphite? Graphite slows neutrons better than water, so it boosts efficiency. So they hung a graphite displacer under the boron rod. When the rod was pulled up, the graphite remained, helping the chain reaction. Great in theory, but there was a problem. The reactor was already built. Its core height was 7 meters. But below the core, there was only 5 meters of space, so the graphite displacer had to be shorter, around 5 meters. Now we have boron carbide, under it 5 meters of graphite, and beneath that, water. In some situations, this system backfired. That night was one of them. As the rod entered the core, the top was absorbing neutrons, but at the bottom, graphite replaced water. Water gave weak moderation. But graphite? It gave a surge in thermal neutrons, which intensified the reaction. Combined with the steam effect, this created a tip effect, a power spike at the rod's leading edge. This combination triggered the catastrophic result. And the tip effect, the idea that inserting the rod could increase reactivity in the lower part of the core, it had been known since 1983. It was recorded in technical documentation at the Ignalina NPP in Lithuania. Scientists flagged it as dangerous, but nothing was done. And crucially, operators were never told. They didn't know. They had no tools or procedures to account for it, because officially, it didn't exist. There's one more point. I've said it before. The tip effect only occurs in certain situations. And that night, all the conditions were met. The key was a low operational reactivity margin, ORM. Roughly speaking, this means how many control rods are still left in the core. If you pull them all out, you have nothing left to control the reaction. Regulations varied. Some said at least 30 rods, others 15. Confusing. But in essence, ORM measures how much reactivity can be added by withdrawing the rods. And the operators didn't even have an instrument to measure it. The margin dropped too low. That made the tip effect even more dangerous. After the accident, they finally installed ORM monitors across all RBMKs. It turned out to be a critical safety parameter. The low-power regulators were also problematic. They're more sensitive, but less effective at high power. When you drop power levels, the high-power regulators switch off, and the low-power ones should kick in automatically. But that automation hadn't been installed. Operator Leonid Toptonov missed the transition point. There was heavy system load and no automatic switch, so power dropped. He manually enabled the low-power regulators and stabilized it. Later, they raised power again. But the failure to switch caused an unplanned power collapse. Yes, Toptonov missed it, but the automation should have handled it. That's a design flaw that helped trigger the explosion. Too much burden was placed on the operator. No ORM display, no automatic transition. All these flaws added up. Later, they tried to estimate what the ORM had been. Less than 15? More? No one knows for sure. But blaming the operators for violating that parameter is wrong. They were working blind.
At 1:23 a.m., the test began. The turbine was shut off. Cooling started to fail. Reactivity spiked. The AZ5 emergency shutdown button was pressed, but due to the graphite tips of control rods, that move caused an immediate and massive power surge. The reactor exploded. A second explosion followed, likely to the steam and hydrogen buildup.
In the morning, I was having my coffee in my apartment. My windows faced the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Did I look out and see the destroyed unit? No, I didn't. I just got ready, walked out, and got on the bus. There were only a few people on board, maybe a dozen, maybe 15. No one said anything to me, no warnings, nothing about what had happened overnight. I was just going to work as scheduled. And as we were getting closer, I was lost in thought, maybe still half asleep. Then someone said, "Oh, what's wrong with the unit?" That's when I looked up, and I saw it. It didn't take long to understand, no time at all, really. You could tell instantly this was no ordinary accident. This was something massive and terrifying. So in the end, I didn't hear about it. I just saw it. I slept well. I didn't hear anything, no explosions, no flashes like some people say. It's a pity, actually. Even now, people argue. Some say it was one explosion, others say two. Some claim it was a whole series of blasts. It would have been something to witness it myself.
Unlike many accounts that follow only the explosion, Oleksiy Breus walked into the control room of Reactor 4 the next morning. He worked his shift as radioactive dust was filling the air. The scale of the disaster was still unknown, and yet operators and engineers were trying to make sense of the chaos. Firefighters had arrived overnight with no protective gear, unaware of the radiation. Many of them died days later. Plant workers like Breus, meanwhile, continued showing up, with little more than rumors and dosimeters that maxed out.
24 of my colleagues died, but their deaths weren't just random casualties caught in the explosion. They managed to do something incredibly important under those conditions, to reduce the consequences of Chernobyl. They can't tell us that now. I survived, and I believe it's my life's duty to speak about it. I received a dose, I've said this before, 120 Baer, or in international units, 120 rem, which is 1.2 sieverts. A lethal dose is around 600 rem, or 6 sieverts. So I didn't reach the fatal threshold, but some of my colleagues exceeded it. I was 27 at the time of Chernobyl, still a young person, not fully formed, mentally or emotionally. Chernobyl gave me something to hold on to, a kind of psychological core. If before it was all just confusion, now it became solid, structured, a kind of inner core and some external direction in life. Maybe not just one, but a sense of priority. And one of those directions is to tell this story. After Chernobyl, the operators were blamed, unjustly, unfairly, and without evidence. They were accused of causing the reactor to explode, accused without reason. In plain words, my fellow operators were dragged through the mud. So let me briefly explain what my colleagues and I, the operators, actually did. 5 key tasks. I believe it's my duty to share them. Task 1. They fought fires in different parts of the unit, sometimes with the firefighters, sometimes without them. And remember, it's the operators who provide water for the fire crews at a nuclear power plant. Task 2. Operators searched for, found, and carried out the injured. They handed them over to the medical staff. Task 3. We had to investigate the condition of the equipment, pipelines, rooms, and above all, the state of the reactor. This meant running all over the unit. It was like a video game, running through deadly obstacles and traps. And those were the same traps that took our operators' lives. There were collapsed rooms, flooded areas with hot water, hot steam, radiation. People suffered thermal and radiation burns, falling concrete, tight spaces you had to crawl through, live electrical wires, electrocution risks. That was our working environment. Task 4. Preventing additional disasters, reducing risks where possible. For example, there were oil tanks containing hundreds of liters of oil that could ignite at any moment. Someone had to go in and open special valves so the oil would drain into underground containment vessels, designed for that purpose. That act alone prevented a second fire. In another case, hydrogen had to be removed from the generator, or it could have exploded. Someone entered the danger zone, performed the switch, and that explosion was avoided. They received a high radiation dose for doing it. Task 5. Looking back, it may seem pointless, but at the time it was considered necessary. Supplying water to the reactor, even though the reactor no longer existed. But per our engineering judgment, and according to all the rules, we had to try. It was part of our official instructions. Common sense and our training told us we must do it. By around 10 or 11 a.m., it became clear the reactor was gone, so those efforts mostly stopped. But Moscow was calling, demanding that we continue trying to pump water. Until 4 p.m., they insisted. It was hard for the officials to accept that the reactor no longer existed. It was hard for us too at first. It took us hours to fully comprehend, but we saw it with our own eyes. For Moscow bureaucrats, that truth was even harder to accept. At 3:45 p.m., I personally tried to switch on the last surviving pump at Unit 4 to once again send water to the reactor. I knew it was absurd. We all knew. But the command had come from Moscow. As I've said before, it was surreal. But the other 4 tasks, they were absolutely essential. They were carried out. Everything that could be done was done. While 6 firefighters died, 20 of my colleagues, operators, perished. It was those exact tasks that took their lives. The one thing we never managed was to find one person, Valery Kodymchuk, the reactor hall operator. To this day, his body remains somewhere inside the sarcophagus. We still don't know exactly where, but he's there. Everyone else was saved, and more disasters were prevented. But the cost was lives. This, for me, is the most important subject of all. I survived, and I will always speak about this, and I always will.
Chernobyl was a wake-up call. It showed the world why reactor design matters, why training and transparency are critical, and why politics must never override safety. Modern nuclear reactors are safer, but only if we learn from the past.
A friend of mine once said, "If a farmer has a horse that served him well, and one day it kicks and injures him, what then? Send it to the slaughterhouse? No. He'll keep using that horse to plow, to haul. You don't just throw it away. On a farm, it's still needed." Back in the 1990s, Ukraine's Institute of Sociology conducted a survey, and it turned out the farther people lived from Chernobyl, the more they feared it. The problem here is likely lack of knowledge. The less a person knows about something, the more they fear it. At first, I too leaned toward the idea that nuclear energy had a right to exist and to develop. But gradually, I stepped away from the nuclear field. I started working in journalism. My perspective changed. I kept my knowledge, of course. But now that I wasn't inside the system, I began looking at it from the outside. And over time, I found myself more of a critic than a supporter of nuclear energy. Not so much because of technical or engineering issues, but because of the human mentality behind it. Take 3 Mile Island. If I remember correctly, the accident happened due to a cooling water issue. The system showed that the water supply was on, but in fact, it wasn't. Though I may be wrong, but the designers hadn't accounted for that. After Chernobyl, the Soviet official version blamed the operators. They said mistakes and violations by the staff led to the disaster. But those are two different things: mistakes and violations. To be honest, this version makes no sense. If a reactor is designed in such a way that a human error can lead to a catastrophe, that's a crime. Such reactors shouldn't exist. And we can't claim that today's reactor designs are so perfect that this could never happen again. That's why I stand more among the opponents of nuclear energy. The human factor plays a huge role. Even at the design stage, the initial design was flawed. Then came the upgrade with graphite displacers, and after that, no one rushed to fix it. The human factor, at the level of engineering and scientific oversight, was the main cause of Chernobyl.
Thank you for watching this episode about Chernobyl, and huge thanks to Oleksiy Breus for his time, honesty, and courage to tell his own story. If you found this episode valuable, like, share, and subscribe, because nuclear education matters.